Good morning. How are you doing, Art Appreciation non-Western class? I hope you're doing fantastically well. I'm playing you one of my favorite pieces of music ever. It makes me smile and think about Africa every time I hear it, the opening to Lion King. This is by far my favorite continent on the planet to visit. I've been to Africa more than 100 times. I've lived there for the better part of a number of years now. Out of 55 countries that are currently there in Africa, I've actually got to visit 54. I've lived in 5 different nations, traveled around. A spectacular place. So let me introduce you to a place that I love. As you can see from the various photos, some of which are mine, some of which are kind of borrowed from other sources, we'll talk about Africa and I'll talk about it in very loving terms within the process. So up here is my family. You can see here's me. That is my wife, who is a brilliant professor at FIU in the psychology program, clinical psychology program. She brings children's health and mental services into areas that traditionally don't have it, like park districts and schools. And my lovely daughter, who got to go off to college to study musical theater. So she actually got to sing and dance with the Masai. And my little guy here, my son, who actually is not so little anymore, he's in high school. So you'll notice there's multiple different regions that show up here. We actually were there the last time to see the great wildebeest migration across the Mara River. And here, of course, is one of the great masquerades you may see if you go to Disney World and Animal Kingdom Lodge. It's called the Nigeria Masquerade from Ido. Of course, the mountain gorillas up in Rwanda, which is a day hike, very difficult to get into. But these are our closest known relatives on our evolutionary tree as of right now. If you don't know what Africa is, it's this large landmass. And note how huge it is compared to the United States. The United States would fit here, just in the Sahara Desert, and then there would be 2 more United States that actually could still fit. So when we talk about Africa, we often put all these different groups and people together, and that's just not the case. Africa has multiple different languages and ethnicities, but we generally blanket together just because we understand so little about the cultures. So my work in Africa involves everything from United Nations humanities work. If you don't remember, I do genocide work for the United Nations. I helped broker the peace treaty that took place in Sudan a year and a half ago. I've worked in Sudan for 10 years. I was in Rwanda 10 days after the genocide supposedly ended and then continued into the Congo. I've worked with rape crisis victims, individuals in the Congo. I've worked with Sudanese refugees all throughout East Africa. And so I've had a very fruitful career actually on the African continent, working specifically for women and children's rights in war-torn areas. Since then, I've been a cultural consultant. I've got to work a lot with Disney and other sets. So here's me on set in Uganda, where we were filming part of The Queen of Katwe. So I don't know if you know right here, but this is Lupita Nyong'o, a really wonderful woman that shows up. Here's a Masai school where I taught actually for a little while. UN Somali refugees at a camp that I worked at, various animals, as well as what I had showed you before about my children and family being with me in East Africa for a little bit. Here, when I was in Masai Mara National Park in Kenya, that is where I lived. Actually, that was my house in the middle of a bush that shows up all the way out here. Up here was actually the school, or a portion of the school where we taught in. So you see how small the crawl is. And that was my giraffe that greeted me every day. Here's to a lovely Masai individual actually fixing my house before I moved in. And here's Gerald, my giraffe. I've lived all throughout Africa, just to show you the idea of modernity or not. So when I was in Kenya, this is where I was living here. This is my house in Nigeria, Ndewo, is how you say hello. And when I worked at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka as a chem and environmental studies professor, I worked right there. Here's my peanut cellar. You make individual relationships with each individual. And when I started, before I moved in here, when I worked for the United Nations and I worked in Kenya, I was staying at the Y and working with people in one of the largest slum communities in all over the world. And that was my flat where I stayed as I was working when I wasn't out in tent communities and so on. So this is my work in Kenya. So my flat versus where I actually had to stay most of my days. And I'm going to have to pause this for a minute. And that's only because we want to be able to go back so our music doesn't keep going on and on. That's one of my favorite pieces of music over and over. So the question here is, why do we study Africa? And so I want to show you two different images before we start talking about that. Note the Nairobi. Nairobi is in Kenya. It's the African daily market where you can buy baskets and goods, art, and there's potatoes and tomatoes and everything you buy with individuals. You make a relationship with individual sellers who offer you a good price, and they will actually try to attract you by offering you a little bit extra that you make a relationship. And so my peanut seller, Aisha, for example, in Nigeria, that I always go to when I'm in Nsukka, I would buy 2 cups of peanuts, and she'd give me 2.5 cups. And so I would come back to her. We established a shopping relationship began. If she was not there, I was expected to come back on a different day to actually buy my peanuts from her. And so I wouldn't buy them from another seller unless they were representing her family or her kinship ties. And then we're going to have this huge idea of masquerades, which are one of the kind of unique forms of art that shows up in non-Western world that we really don't have in our Western world. So why study Africa, besides the lovely pyramids behind us? Africa is the birthplace of humankind. When we do evolutionary studies, we basically always look to East Africa in particular, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia. We look at Tanzania. One of the famous, most oldest kind of groups is the Olduvai Gorge, where we found the skeleton of Lucy, one of the oldest skeleton remains we have. And we believe that from genetics and from DNA testing, everyone came out of Africa. One of our first great civilizations on the Nile River is actually in Africa, in Egypt. And Africa was technologically ahead of Europe being in the slave trade, but the gun mitigated all that technology and iron work in terms of art, culture, science. Later on, Africans are going to have an enormous impact on world culture, as we probably could see, even in terms of having an African or African-skinned individual that was our last president, when President Obama, including the development of many Western musical styles. So if you like jazz, hip hop, gospel, rock and roll, swing, rap or gangster rap, even variations on classical music. A lot of those have musical underpinnings that show up in African cultures. Breakdancing as well, and any Latino music, whether it's bachata, merengue, salsa, all come out of the tradition that comes out of Africa. European colonialism established many of the problems that we have today. This is not to say that the Africans did not have problems beforehand. Of course they did. Every place has problems, just like the United States has problems today. But the idea of genocide, some economic underdevelopment, the natural resource use and being used by Western outsiders, and the local population not receiving a fair wage benefit, that really is a product of kind of the colonialism and post-colonial that we still live in. Basically, we can talk about it being a capitalist underdevelopment of culture that shows up. And they have a new political system that we haven't yet seen or talked about that really is called communalism, the idea of everyone working together. So they have a huge impact on modern art, especially Picasso, and they still control 24% or 25% of the world's oil supply today. So from African art, you can see clearly Picasso borrowed these African art influences. Now, the thing that actually surprises most people, and what I like when I travel around and give different tours, different talks, or teach college classes about individuals, so I want them to understand basically these 10 main ideas about Africa. If you understand these 10 main, you actually can get a pretty good overview and think about what actually Africa brings to the table, what's different, what's unique from a different cultural perspective. First off, Africans want the same things as Americans, as everywhere else around the world. We want loving families. We want our kids to have a better life than us. We want them to have opportunities. We want them to have an education, and we want them to feel safe, both in the natural world and from one another within the process. We want to find love and long-lasting love and be close to our families and live in a happy kind of household. Make sure that they are of good moral stock. everyone around the world wants this. And so what we talk about here is that we have common concerns, but we have different responses to those concerns based upon history, geography, and culture, as we'll see. Number two. Oh, and we can talk about this even in terms of weddings. Here are different variations from the Masai wedding, but no, we're going to exchange gifts. We're going to host a feast. Men and women are actually going to come from around, including wearing their best garbs. Men and women are going to dress up. It's going to be a sacred ceremony, at least for most components. And today there's a legal ceremony that goes along with it that combines the family and the community together. And it's a vested interest to make sure that that works. So divorce should not happen all that often. And so that's basically the same features we have. If we look at the 10 most interesting African weddings today that I want to show you within this image, it's interesting how similar many of the traditions are if you think about it from a foundational aspect. Note the white for purity, men and women being celebrated by the family, large group gathering, group dancing on the dance floor, all coming together. The presentation of the bride and groom we saw earlier, you may now kiss the bride. So this is a Swahili wedding where you wear your best Swahili dress. So a combination of traditional Kenyan, African perspectives, but also Arab perspectives. So Swahili is actually a model language. You'll note the number of people on cell phones, even in modern day settings. So this is a Yoruba wedding. For those of you that practice or your families practice Haitian, Vodun, Candomblé, Santeria, a lot of the religious beliefs come out of the Yoruba over with slaves that were brought out of the Yoruba nation into the New World. So some of these, including the idea of spraying people with money, come into American traditions. And when we come back, you may notice I'm wearing a Yoruba tie-dye shirt today. So here we have the presentation of different gender roles and dancing coming together to form a new whole. So the entire family dances together. The beautiful kente cloth wrapped around, along with gold jewelry. Wedding rings, diamond, and gold mostly comes from West Africa. The presentation of gifts. Formal dancers, actually almost like flower girls, only in a much older capacity that shows up, that are decorating and beautifying the place. And kente becoming the symbol of African American culture. When African Americans actually graduate, many of them will actually wear kente cloth as part of their graduation ceremony. It also became the national or international symbol of Kwanzaa. And so Africa is culturally and geographically diverse, as you saw from the different traditions. And you may not know the nations around it, but you'll know we'll have individuals that are living in all sorts of different, very modern cities playing video games. At the same age, we'll have individuals that are responsible, the Masai, particularly in Kenya and Tanzania, which are responsible for taking care of goats and cattle, sometimes as young as 5 and 6 years old. We'll have individuals that live in swamps. We have individuals that live in the Sahel, in grasslands, in mountains, in forests. Africa, like the United States, has almost every geographic capacity on Earth. And so one of the things I'd like to share with you is that how geography has actually impacted Africa. It's an interesting video that talks about
Hey, so before I start, I just
how
wanted to say
difficult
this
it is to
video idea
categorize
came to me
Africa.
from a college professor I had, and it's only a theory, okay? Got that? A theory. Good. So Africa is pretty amazing. It's a rich land with some spectacular resources and natural beauty. It contains the world's second largest rainforest, the Congo rainforest. Impressive deposits of gold, iron, and copper are to be found here, among many other minerals, and it features some of the
And this is
richest
also one that
wildlife
has
areas
coltan
on
in
the
your
globe.
cell phone.
But also today, many places in Africa lag behind the rest of the world when it comes to life expectancy, income, and access to resources like fresh water and food. This leads many to ask why, in a land so abundant with resources, is there such scarcity and lack of development? Well, as it turns out, geography might be to blame. Many people connect the issues plaguing Africa today back to colonialism, which is a fair assessment, but for me, it doesn't really capture the full picture. That's not to say colonialism hasn't had horrific and lasting consequences on the people of Africa, but it's possible that the true issue is one with the continent itself. All of this might come down to the fact that Africa is longer than it is wide. Really. Here's Eurasia, Europe, and Asia. You can see it's much longer than it is tall. But looking at Africa, it's virtually the opposite, stacked vertically, taller than it is long. This might not sound like a big deal, but just you wait. So if you haven't realized, depending on your latitude, the climate of an area will change. Near the equator will be hot and humid, while near the poles will be cold and dry, for the most part. But changing longitude doesn't really affect these things. So being longer than tall, Eurasia has mostly the same climate types throughout, whereas Africa passes through many different climate zones. It starts with the Mediterranean climate, which quickly becomes semi-desert. Full desert is next, then it's back to semi-desert, sometimes called the Sahel. After the Sahel comes grasslands, which finally become forest. At this point, we have crossed over the equator, and we begin to find more grassland, then more semi-desert, another full desert, and then finally back to the Mediterranean climate we found at the northern tip of the continent. Then add in features like highland climates, where there's highland arid, semi-humid, and humid, and you have a very fractured landscape. Compare this to Eurasia, which has a polar climate, a temperate climate, a small Mediterranean climate, a desert, and a tropical zone. There are some alpine areas as well, most notably the Himalayas, but even still, you can see these massive areas of single climates form, and each one roughly corresponds with a powerful area. So the eastern temperate zone became China, while the tropical zone to the south became India. The desert became the Muslim Empire, and the western temperate region became the powers of Europe. The Mediterranean also roughly corresponds with the heart of the Roman Empire. What all of this shows is that large areas of the same climate allow civilizations to unite, grow, and thrive. This happens because people who live in a single climate survive by farming and hunting the same foods, experience the same hardships, and therefore live very similar lives. This allows them to interact with each other, forming a common language and systems of interaction like trade and defense from outsiders. They develop the same lifestyle and end up sharing a common culture without even trying. In short, climate unites people through culture. It's interesting to think that the reason the Roman Empire failed was because of invaders from the north who lived in a different climate zone and therefore held different values and cultures than the Romans who tried to conquer them. And the Mongols who invaded China never permanently ruled, also being from a different climate zone, while they did have great success conquering westward, where the climates were roughly the same. It seems these places were destined to remain independent, in large part due to their unifying geography, which made them resilient to outside forces. But in Africa, you didn't really get this. Of course, some empires emerged. States like Egypt and Mali experienced times of great power and prosperity, but Egypt was locked to the Nile and was never capable of expanding much beyond the river valley, and Mali straddled the narrow Sahel region between the Sahara and the tropics, which was much larger centuries ago, but still limited. Beyond their lands, they found people with vastly different lifestyles and cultures who would resist assimilation by different cultures, and they became trapped by their own climate, unable to expand and develop further. A map of individual African culture groups would look something like this, with thousands of tribes and clans, each one distinct and therefore opposed to joining forces to resist all outside powers. This also caused small tribes to never develop much trade beyond their neighbors, and therefore new ideas and technologies could not easily diffuse through Africa the same way they had between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. That's not to say Africa didn't have innovations of its own, and actually many of mankind's earliest advancements in language, medicine, architecture, and mathematics came from Africa. But without large-scale exchange throughout the continent and with other civilizations, these advancements were impeded and the numerous tribes of Africa fell behind technologically. By the 16th century, Africans were confronted by people who had benefited from a unifying geography and trade with distant lands. They wielded guns, sailed on massive ships, and completely overpowered local populations. Africans fell victim to harsh colonial rule while foreign powers competed to take advantage of the land that had doomed its own inhabitants. Because Europe was smaller and relatively poor in resources, Europeans were forced to seek outside their own lands to advance their civilizations. So geography both caused the Africans to lag behind and also encouraged Europeans to push out beyond their own lands. Then the colonizers grouped the people into arbitrary borders. So desert tribes could be paired with a Sahel and a forest tribe and told they were one, like in the modern country of Mali. This, of course, led to internal issues within basically every African nation. Dissension and civil war has followed in nearly every state since colonization. And you can see the countries that have had the most success today are the ones that lucked out and ended up with borders that coincided with the natural climate zones. These included nations like Ethiopia, which for the most part is humid and mountainous and managed to maintain independence throughout colonization. Egypt, which is all desert surrounding a single river with a long history of unity. And South Africa, which is mostly semi-arid Mediterranean climate. And where it wasn't, they allowed the tribes to stay independent, like this nation of Lesotho, smack dab in the middle of the country. There are, of course, simplifications in all of this, but generally speaking, this is how geography made it difficult for African empires to expand and withstand the test of time. Thanks for watching. I hope I didn't step on too many toes with this one. Let me know how I did in the comments. Again, this is just a theory I learned, and of course, other factors were at play as well.
And so as you think about that kind of aspect as well, also think about the notion then that South America, we often think, and actually North America and South America, rather than being very, very wide, is much longer as well. And you'll notice there's a bunch of different striations that show up from different geographic regions there as well. It's not nearly as culturally advanced as we have in the kind of the Roman Empire leading to the Silk Road, because they were sharing basically the same geography, the same natural resources across vast swatches of land with really 3 major climates showing up, whereas we have 7 or 8 when we look at North to South America, and the same is true with Africa. So the idea is Africa is culturally and geographically diverse. The two are tied together. The third is the African diaspora. If you don't know what diaspora actually means, spreading out. So this is actually the slave population that came and was forced into the New World, and also immigration and refugees that actually have continued to come out and towards the Western world, and actually into Europe and even into the Middle East, bringing all sorts of ideas, new religions, new ideas, and we'll be talking explicitly about this kind of in our next lecture that shows up. So much so that you may not know this, but Bugs Bunny himself is a West African trickster god. And this act that you're seeing, Rabbit Season, Duck Season, is literally based upon a West African trickster tale of the god Eshu, who's the trickster god. Exu, we also see is called Exu, EXU, in various Afro-Caribbean world religions, such as Candomblé, in Bahia, in Cuba, in Santeria, in Haitian Voodoo, and in Voodoo in New Orleans. So the idea of a particular god tricking people and believing that he's in the transformation of an animal. It started off with Brer Rabbit, and Warner Brothers wanted to compete with Brer Rabbit, so they made Bugs Bunny, because Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox were doing so well. So this is the trickster part of Eshu. And of course, so it eventually becomes rabbit season and it gets switched. The fourth thing, and we're going to come back and spend an entire class on this, is death and the ancestors. The idea that starts off in ancient Egypt, which we mentioned before in China, in Japan, with death and kind of different festivals around the world, is that 72% of the world's population currently believes in ancestral spirits, and that there's a better place for you to go once you pass on. That is an African religious concept that developed 4,000 years ago in Egypt, which led to the ideas and that have everything to do with the Abrahamic faith of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, dealing with heaven and hell, the idea of paradise versus kind of this hellish area that shows up. And so we will be talking about this. We mentioned this once before. Why are humans fascinated with death and the afterlife? Almost all humans fear death for different reasons. And we had talked about this before, the fear of the process of dying itself, the fear of punishment. If you believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful God that allows you into heaven, well, you've done some wrong things that need punishment for. Fear of the unknown, just in case you're wrong. And fear of the annihilation, what happens if there's nothing? So the Egyptian concepts that came out, so we talked about before, at death you become an ancestral spirit. The ancestral spirits are 10 to 100 times more powerful than you. And the ancestral spirit acts as a go-between between you and the gods. This is believed by 72% of the world's population, even in terms of the movie Coco that came out from Disney Pixar animation a few years ago, deals with this idea of a day when you can go and visit the ancestors. We see these festivals in Japan, in China, and all over Asia, 72% of the world's population. So we have the fantasy coffins from Ghana, we'll talk about Mexican Day of the Dead, Japanese Oban Festival, and then the idea of these beautiful fantasy coffins, being buried in something that is significant, and that is your coffin of your life, whether you are a preacher, a Pepsi or Coca-Cola salesman, a good fisherman, a cell phone distributor, a driver, a photographer, or a mother hen for a very devoted mother. And this is part of the reason why the Egyptians spent so much time, money, and energy creating one of the 7 wonders of the world, and the only one that survives today, with 80 pyramids discovered, huge funerary monuments, each one having 3 million stones. The average stone is 10 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet. I mean, that's a basketball court height, wide, and width almost in all directions. Taking 30 years to make, taking 20,000 different people to make them. They stopped building them because grave robbers were breaking into them, but then they just cut them into the caves, as we talked about earlier, and they served as lighthouses. They were so large in the desert. Here you can see a person on the camel. They're ridiculous, tallest building on earth for the better part of 4,000 years, largely because they were built for living gods and pharaohs who would actually become ancestral spirits that would convene with the gods and come back and help individuals. That's why they spent so much time, money, and energy on death. It's a really remarkable kind of accomplishment as we look at through the stuff. Other African populations are going to use this today. And so one of my favorite artworks, which I'll spend a moment on, but we'll come back and do this later, are the Duen, Fubara ancestral screens, which actually means forehead of the dead. They're only made by one family of the Calabar Ijal, which is a group right on the coast of Nigeria, and they're made by the family that's called the Pokia family. Only about 20 of these had ever been made, and that is because the person who they represent, who's a real person, has to have 3 major social divisions in society. They have to be a master of the Ikin Water Society. They lived in the swampy marshland. A Perrier warrior cult. So each of them, notice, has aggressive and oftentimes will have heads here or heads below, showing heads that they took in battle. And they have to be an individual that's established a new warri trading house. So then they are only carved for the most powerful men, including a founder of a lineage, a founder of a new warri trading house. They had to be a phenomenal dancer. They had to have the highest grade in the Akin Water Society, and they had to actually have 5 surviving children. So this is a very rare accomplishment. When we come back and look at Black Panther even deals with the aspect of Black Panther going to visit his family in the ancestral world, if you remember. Right? They bury him as if he's going. Africans believe they actually have that ability, that they actually have that possibility. We're going to have the idea of science versus magic, specifically when we talk about African medicine and what African medicine means. Is this actually what a doctor looks like, or is this what a doctor look like? This is what doctors look like in general in Africa. They actually do both. And the whole point of science versus magic, and I love this quote, again, we'll have another talk on this about Africa later on, so we won't go into too much detail, is this. When a Westerner looks at a jungle, he sees green, herbs, vines, shrubs, and trees. When a native looks at the jungle, he sees the basics of life, food, medicines, and raw materials from which to build shelters, weave hammocks, and carve a hunting bow. So that's what was said by an African shaman. So when I look at this, I see danger, or there might be snakes, there might be things lurking. When an African medicine man or shaman sees this, what they are going to see is really the building blocks of life. I see ibuprofen. I see something when your stomach gets hurt. I see potentially an anti-malarial drug. It's very different ways of looking at nature. And so various different medical drugs actually come from rainforest plants that we've actually taken from the Western world and put into a pill form, and they still give you the tea that shows up. So for example, vampire bat saliva helps prevent heart attacks. So there's a chemical actually in the saliva. So they collect vampire bat saliva. You could imagine drinking that in a tea. It's got the same exact active ingredient as our medicines that show up. And so we have cortisone. And cortisone is from wild yams. Cortisone is what we get in hydrocortisone shots. It's also very good for birth control pills. Quinine, which we actually put in tonic. So if you've had gin and tonic or tonic water with quinine, that very bitter, that's an anti-malarial drug. So we're just borrowing these things. And so when you go to an herbal doctor, or they're just called a doctor, this is what you may experience to try to make yourself healthy. They also have what we would call magic, but other ways of using medicine to actually control good social agencies. And so almost behavioral modification by scaring an individual because the gods and the ancestors know who does what. And so by activating them, it might encourage individuals to actually come out and apologize for what they did, to make retribution for what they did, or not do it again because these ancestors might cause one of them to be ill or someone in their family to get ill, and it would be their fault. So we'll come back and we'll also deal with this. Number 6, tradition versus modernity. We often think of Africa and also in the Western world that, oh, there's tradition, that's the old stuff, and modernity. But what happens is there's a flow that happens. Probably there are different traditions that have changed since you began your life and your family within the process. Whether that's during the Christmas meal, you sat at the little kids' table, and now you've moved to a larger kids' table, or more people had children, so younger generations go to a different table, and we change the age that shows up. There's all these traditions that change that happen all the time. For example, the United States of America, our first Thanksgiving probably did not have turkey. And if we did, it was in very limited quantity, just something we didn't have. And yet we established an entire tradition about that. The tradition of Santa Claus bringing gifts, that's new. That's only been around for about 100 years. In 1800s in Europe, particularly in places like London and Paris, people used to knock angrily on your door and demand the best food you have. And if you didn't, they would actually throw things at your food or things at your house because you weren't giving enough to the poor during the process. It was a drunken revelry party. In fact, the early American colonists outlawed Christmas because it was seen too boisterous, too aggressive, and they wanted to have nothing to do with it. There's a great video actually out on this by and it's called How Adam Ruins Everything, the native origins of native origins of Christmas from a pagan ritual from the Romans. So even here, so we have a lovely traditional Chihuahua mask, a beautiful mask, dance, and agricultural ceremonies. Well, look what they've done in the modern day world. They've done the same thing with the modern day artist, Willie Cole. So he calls it Speedster. He makes the same Chihuahua. It can be used in the exact same fashion, but he's using bicycle parts in the more modern world within the process. Is this tradition if it's danced in the same way, even though it's made of new materials? And that becomes one of the challenges of tradition versus modernity. I mean, same way here. I tell people I lived in Africa and that's where I lived, or this is where I live, the homemade home that shows up in 1983. Look at my office. So in a single day, I would go to a place that had running water and electricity and everything else to a place that had no indoor plumbing. And so I had to navigate those two things back and forth when we look at tradition versus modernity, right next to one another. In modern Africa, you have modern cities with computers. And look, I love this image with the individual on the cell phone. That is actually a plate disc he's had extended out as a symbol of beauty that shows up. We've got beautiful buildings and mosques that show up just like any modern day building. And if you go to different aspects, look at your Burger King, your McDonald's. Here's the South African, basically the South African stack, their version of Burger King. Number 7, a masquerade. And a masquerade is wholly unique to the non-Western world, at least for a religious ceremony, where you have an individual that will often undergo spirit possession and become one of the masqueraders themselves. And so it's very similar to our parades. And so if you look at them, parades build up into a crescendo, a finale act. Santa Claus, the best floats. So do masquerades. Professionals and amateurs showcase their talents. That is true in an African masquerade as well, where the amateurs begin first and slowly leads to the professionals. People talk and mingle socially during the amateur acts. Absolutely true during an African masquerade. Parades and masquerades bring the community together. Absolutely true. I mean, look at the Macy Thanksgiving Day parade. It is amazing that on Thanksgiving Day, what is it, 1 million people watch and a couple 100 million people watch on TV? I know my family does. Parades and masquerades often celebrate cultural heroes, holidays, religious events, and politicians. And parades and masquerades are often used for education and for entertainment. Now more for entertainment in the modern day world, but they used to have a very educational. Here's what Memorial Day was about. Here's what Veterans Day. We've moved much more into a commercial aspect of most of our parades today and lost a lot of that religious. And in terms of the masquerades can be very powerful. So this particular masquerade, which I want to show you very briefly because we'll talk about it later, is called Mende. Mende is the ethnic group rather than tribe, an ethnic group from Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa. And this is called a Sowai masquerade. It is the only masquerade in African's history that is traditionally danced by women. Men almost always did the dancing, and you could say that's sexist. We had that in the Western world as well. Romeo and Juliet. Juliet was played by a young prepubescent boy because it was illegal for women to play the role of men, or for women to play any role in either man or female in Shakespearean theater. It was a crime punishable by time in prison just for acting on stage if you were a female. So when a woman wears the mask, you know they're all slightly different. She wears and she dances, and she comes out of the forest. When she comes out of the forest, she basically determines what type of mask she wants to wear, because each feature emphasizes a different thing, whether she wants some college education, whether she wants to be children, whether she wants to be a homemaker, whether she wants to emphasize beauty, and she basically meets her husband while wearing this mask. Normally it's prearranged that her husband will come up and, or her boyfriend will come up and propose. But this is generally what happens. So here she's like the spirit of the perfect woman that's coming out of the bush. That's the Mende Sowai mask. Number 8, largely set up by colonialism, one of the major problems for understanding Africa today is the following. We have country versus ethnic boundaries. Almost no country in Africa designed their own borders. And that is because there was 2,500 different ethnic groups speaking the better part of 2,000 languages. For example, this country right here, which you may or may not know the shape of, is a country named Nigeria. Nigeria is one of my favorite countries that I've ever been to in the world. And I actually lived right in this area, right in here. And I went back and forth between these two cities. One of the universities I taught at was actually in Enugu. The other one's in Nsukka, which is about an hour south right here. So Igbo is a language, basically that's a tonal language, which means you have to sing it. So a conversation in Igbo sounds like this, ndewo, ndewo, kedu maka, odima, which means hello, hello, how are you doing? And I am fine. And you would say that over and over and over and over. And so it really is a tonal language that you actually have to speak, enunciate, and gorgeous. Terrible for someone who's partially tone deaf and has difficulty hearing, as myself, because some of the tones are very difficult. So you have to look for head bobs and people to move, but you get pretty good with it. And you can read clues from context. These individuals here, the Igbo and the Yoruba, hate each other. And it's getting better over time. But that is because when the European colonial powers came in, they empowered the Igbo and gave them the education and left all these other people out here without education. Because the English then used the Igbo, in this little area here, for all of Nigeria to act as the individuals that would rule over Nigeria. So the Igbo let it get a little to their heads as well, because they had better education. better education for their children, that they started to slightly abuse or over abuse that power that they were given. And even if they weren't over abusing it, these people, because they were raised up and making higher salaries now, would have felt that way anyway. So there was a great Biafran war where one group, the Yoruba in particular, who is the dominant number here, wanted to exterminate the Igbo. And that took place in the 1960s. That was completely a setup issue because we were put them in a one box and said, all right, when the Europeans left, all right, it's time for you guys to fight for power. The Hausa make up roughly a third of the group. The Yoruba make up a third of the population, and the Igbo make up roughly a third of the population when we divide in terms of. And so when one group really does dominate the others can easily pass on, and we can very easily get into ethnic conflict and of all sorts of wars that show up. They should have never been put in the same country together. Number 9, a very limited modern education. Their education system traditionally was based upon an initiation system because they weren't based upon modern global economy. That's something that when the colonials came in, they really kind of enforced. And now a lot of Africans want to be absolutely involved with that economy, but not all. For example, one of the best teachers that I know that I've never met is this individual here. His name was Chukwuemeka Nze. And Chukwuemeka is spectacular. If he had the type of resources that I have, he would be an award-winning, a global award-winning teacher. He was fantastic. Some of these children walked from 5 miles away to underneath this tree to work with Chukwuemeka. He drew in the dirt. He drew pictures. He was amazing in every capacity, and almost always had to teach outside without air conditioning, without electricity, and he's amazing. So that limited modern education. Now, should say Africa in particular has gotten much better in the last 20 years, but still has a long way to go to catch up with any of our modern day resources. And traditionally, the way they educated their men and women was through initiation. Why? They didn't need to know how to make beef stroganoff, which is what the colonials, they really didn't need much math. Men needed to know the things that were man and what they were responsible for, that they'd been responsible for the better part of 4,000 years. So they would need to know about masquerading. They needed to know farming, hunting, how to be a father, a husband, a use of nature, myths, ancestor, dancing, and sex. Women needed to know about the spirit world, cooking, gathering food, mother, wife, the natural meds they would have to keep people healthy without going to a doctor, housekeeping, ancestors, dancing, and sex. And so these were two very different ways of preparing you to become a man and a woman in Africa. Even today, it is interesting that we actually in Africa teach young men how to be fathers and young women how to be mothers. We do not do that in the United States and other places. We have a lot of problems with that. We also teach them how to be a devoted husband and devoted wife in an African context, which we do a lot over the world. The Indian sex manual, the Karma Sutra, also did this. No, we don't have a tradition like doing that, except watching television or your parents modeling behavior for you in the Western world. It just doesn't exist. We've imagined you'll figure it out. Not everyone does. Divorce rates are 43% or higher. I won't go to the math. I'll talk about those next time. And finally, the relationship with the natural world. Now, like in Polynesia and Oceania, where we talked about the idea of mana, or in China, where we talked about the flow of qi, there is this energy that flows all throughout all sorts of different elements. It flows through people, it flows through the beautiful animals, through the sunset. It also flows through materials that you make artwork. So the more combined elements that you put on that are power, the more powerful the particular artwork can become. And when an artist or a masquerader wears it and puts it on, they absorb some of that energy as well. So there's a real relationship with trying to control the flow of energy, mana, depending upon where you are. In Africa, the two most common terms are Ashe from West Africa and Niama, actually from the Mande region. We'll talk about both of those, but kind of they're the energy of action. They're the energy of heating you up. And your job is to both get heated up, but also control that heating up so you don't do something stupid, right? It's great to be heated up, but road rage actually hurts you and other individuals. Get heated up to where you might get an argument and win your particular point, but you still have to control your logic and your rational actions. So we have a relationship with the modern world. And part of that is their continent looks radically different, as we saw in the video earlier, where we start off the Sahara Desert, to put in perspective, this dark brown area here, where people are living here like the Tuareg. This is as large as the entire United States of America. You think about that, from coast of, LA to New York City, that's the entire region. It's like a giant ocean just out of sand. It's almost impossible to cross. One of the cool world experiences with that nature is that you see my epic fail here. So here's my teacher at the time, Talib. This was in southern Egypt, and I'm trying to do it, and I was awful at it. Balance is not my thing. Even looking at a wedding in the desert. So here's the nomadic Tuareg wedding. And so as we look at different cultures from around, we have common concerns and different responses in terms of kind of choosing a bride or choosing a husband, all the way down to how do we educate our children? What's the most important things for them to know? For me in the United States of America, my most important things is for my students to learn how to read, to write, to be good global citizens. And there, the most important thing might be able to find water, and then find food, and then to make sure you know how to heal yourself because there is no doctor in the immediate area. So we have radically different responses based upon geography and where things are. So all the way up from the Sahara, these migratory cultures, to the Sahel, which is this light brown area right here, which is very dry. And you can grow some crops, like particularly onions, that you will trade with other parts. And we'll come back and we'll talk about this. This is the Mande area, one of the great empires from early. And so these are all Mande arts that show up from Mali. And we'll even talk about kind of music within the process and how music sounds differently because of the instruments that are chosen. In this case, it's all about a bard. And because if you live in this area, the most important thing for you to be able to do, this area right here, so not the Sahara, which is this area, but right beneath the Sahara in the green, is to actually go out and hunt, because you are going to need to go and kill most of your meat, because most of you can't actually graze animals. There's not enough to graze. So you're going to have to be great hunters within this area. So as well to go with your onions and very limited other things that you can eat. So we'll come back and talk about the features of African music that comes out of this different aspect. For places where there are agriculture, and particularly where there's enough rain to at least grow some agriculture, such as we have here. This is the same mask we saw made out of bicycle parts before, the Chihuahua, which is an agricultural or antelope mask. We will actually have to have, all right, how do we learn to plant and harvest to make sure that we plant at the right time for when the rains come, and also harvest at the right time so that when the rains end, the seeds are not dried out so we don't starve the next year. So each area is going to have slightly different things that we talk about. Here's two more Willie Coles. Those are those bicycle park Chihuahuas versus an actual Chihuahua mask danced here. And briefly, just to show you what it looks like in an agricultural system. Here's what a Chihuahua or agricultural mask means. They're always danced in male and female parts. The idea of binary gender coming together to populate and create the world, even in terms of agricultural cycles. Right? You need a male and a female antelope to have female antelope babies. And we will come back and actually spend much more time on this. But this is our introductory lecture where I can give you the top 10 here. All right, we're going to come back and look at all that. Now, my information on Africa, I have to thank this individual here, which is ironic when I was a little bit thinner, and hopefully again in the future. This is my graduate advisor. So when I went to study graduate school, I went to Indiana University. It's one of the best, actually at that time, it was the best African art and the African studies program in the entire country, only in second in the world behind Oxford and Cambridge. So I had a professor right here, Dr. Patrick McNaughton, who's an expert in Mande arts, and he studied blacksmiths and therefore that idea of nyama, that energy that we talked about. That's kind of like chi, that energy of action that shows up. So here he is enjoying bird masquerade, where he's the honored guest, where his good friend Sidibalo is supposedly the masquerader, but because you don't know, we only can guess it's Sidibalo because we knew that he danced bird masquerades that showed up. Also, we have wild masks. How do you explain the unwild nature forces? Like sometimes things go wrong in your community, even if you believe everything right. Well, there are wild, uncontrollable, natural forces that happen to be out there, whether that is in the Mayan god of Huracan, where we get hurricanes from. We have typhoon explanations. In the West African perspective of the Mande, they call this a Como, wild mask, and they try to make masquerade to try to control and civilize that masquerade. So here's a Como mask. This Como mask in IU, Indiana University Art Museum, was so active when a Mande individual walked in and sold the Como, they ran out of the museum and refused to come back in, saying that they were not initiated in the Como society and therefore did not have enough energy to be in the museum, anywhere in the museum where that artwork particularly was. I think I have one more I want to show you. We'll come back and look at all that. And then the other thing that shows up, and this is something we are going to have to deal with, who controls non-Western art? We talked about this very briefly early on. We looked at China, but I have a personal story that I'll talk about with Africa showing up. And one of the images that shows up, we'll talk about with the scene of Black Panther, is that and so one of the things that shows up in contemporary African art, what do we do with these artworks that were actually stolen, taken, but then later on we wrote laws that allowed us to steal and take them legally. Basically, we wrote the law that says if you had an artwork after January 1st, 1920, so if it was taken during the colonial period, it's legally yours. Now, that's crazy if you think about it, because white people wrote that law in the end of World War II, establishing that other white people who took other people's artwork that was not white, but also other white people's artwork, you get to keep it yourself. There's all sorts of problems with this particular that we actually have to deal with in the ramification today. And then we're going to deal with the tropical rainforest. So we move down. We've looked at the Sahara. We looked at the Sahel. Now we're in the tropical rainforest area right along the coasts within here, where we have the Ashanti, the Yoruba, Igbo living right along this range in a bunch of different countries, such as this. And we'll come back and we'll deal with all these cultures as well. But note that the whole feature within this, want to make sure that we actually have the idea, is that idea of common concerns, different responses. And those common concerns, different responses come down to, where to go to? There. Our relationship with the natural world. So as a review, here we go. The top 10 things to understand African art. Remember, African wants the same things as Americans. Common concerns, different responses. The reason why we have so many different responses in Africa, sometimes 2,500 different responses to different ethnic groups, languages, and cultures, is because Africa is geographically diverse. We have African diaspora with hundreds of millions of people all over the planet, and their ancestors living in a number of different countries, many times forcibly taken from there. We have the belief in the death and ancestral spirits, where Africans believe they are 10 to 100 times more powerful as an ancestral spirit. They become an ancestral spirit, and the ancestral spirit helps them when they die. And that's why, starting with the Egyptian population, they spend so much time, money, and energy on the Great Pyramids and other arts of death and the afterlife. There's going to be this belief in science versus magic, where we want to classify, in many cases, what Africans do as magic, but really it is actually science. It is tested through generations and generations and generations. Remember, if it doesn't work, why would you continue using it? Tradition versus modernity, the idea that tradition is not the opposite of modernity. There's a change that slowly takes place where traditions become more modern, and then traditions become more modern after that, versus the original traditions, which almost no one has from our original traditions. The idea of masquerades being one of the most important art forms, and masquerades involving everything: the masks, the dance, the costume, the accumulated energy from the various materials that are added in. The country versus ethnic boundaries, which was really established during colonialism, causing major problems within the African population today, putting ethnic groups that really hate one another vying for political power in the same group. And they have limited modern education. We are changing that slowly. But even today, some of the best educated people in the world are New York City cab drivers. If you find a New York City cab driver, it's from Africa, it's probably very likely that they will have at least a master's, if not a bachelor's degree, in economics and medicine. And coming here, we just don't accept their degrees from their African universities. So rather than offering them a gateway that could actually help both the American economy and them attain a higher salary, they become taxi cab drivers in many capacities. And finally, a real relationship with the modern day world, which changes to depend upon the geographic map of Africa. Where do they live? What are the natural resources? What's available to them? What's the tradition? What's the history? And so that's what we're looking at. So those 10 things are the things that once you understand those, you get a good grasp on how to understand Africa. Thank you very much and have a wonderful night. Bye.